everybody, and welcome back to Chapter 6. Chapter 6 is going to focus on homicide. So homicide is the killing of one person by another, and there are multiple categories of homicide that I want you to know. The first is excusable homicide. An excusable homicide is the killing of one human being by another with no guilt, such as in the cases of accidental or unintentional killings. There's also justifiable homicide, and that's going to be a homicide that occurs in the defense of life or property and therefore releases the perpetrator of culpability for the act. There's a couple of laws that exist in certain states. These are fairly well-known laws. It's going to be very specific state to state as to whether or not each state has these laws, but I want you to understand them as they relate to homicide, and the first one is going to be stand your ground laws. Stand your ground laws are laws that legislate that the fact that an individual does not have to retreat in the face of using deadly force if they are using it in self-defense. Like I said, this is going to be a very state-to-state specific issue. There are some states that do not have this at all, but states that do have stand your ground laws mean that if somebody is attacking you in any way, you do not have a legal obligation to retreat, to flee. You may stand your ground and use deadly force and still be justified in the eyes of the law in your use of that deadly force. There's also castle doctrine laws. And castle doctrine laws are laws that legislate the protection of yourself and your family in your own home or domicile. So you do not have to retreat or leave your domicile in the face of somebody who is invading your house and trying to cause you or a family member harm. You are allowed to use deadly force, and it is justifiable because that's the castle doctrine. The castle doctrine is named so because it is your house. We have the greatest right and expectation of privacy in our own home. We spend our whole lives working to pay for our homes. Therefore, it is yours. You should be able to expect to be safe and secure in your home. And if anybody should come in an unwanted, unwelcome capacity and they threaten your safety or they threaten the safety of a loved one or someone in your home, you have the right to protect your castle. You have the right to use deadly force. Within the bounds of the law, you will not be held responsible for homicide under a castle doctrine. There's also criminal homicide, and that's the purposeful, knowing, reckless, and negligent killing of one human being by another. Now, under homicide, there are multiple categories of homicide. Not all homicides are equal. So we're going to start with first-degree murder. And that's a murder that's going to be committed where there is premeditation and there is malice. What does that mean? Premeditation means you planned it. You thought it out. And the point there about premeditation is because you planned it and thought it out, you had a multitude of opportunities every step of the way during the planning to stop yourself and say, what I'm doing is wrong, illegal, unethical, I need to stop. But you didn't. You planned it and you kept moving forward. And malice is exactly what malice sounds like. You want to cause harm. You want to cause harm. First degree murder is a capital crime. Okay. It's going to be a state to state specific issue. Not all states exercise the death penalty anymore, but the states that do, first degree murder is the only crime at the state level that you can exercise a death penalty for. And that is why we call it a capital crime, because you can use capital punishment. Okay. Aside from first degree murder, really the only thing in the country that we can execute for are going to be espionage and treason. And those are federal crimes. Okay. But aside from treason, first degree murder is the only capital crime. It's the only crime punishable by death anywhere in any state in the union. There's also second degree murder. That's going to be murder, but without premeditation. So the offender had negative intent, but they didn't plan to kill anybody. They didn't think this was going to happen. It was a circumstantial event. So the sort of go-to example for second degree murder is, a guy he comes home early from work, he walks into his bedroom and he finds his wife in bed with another man. And in a fit of fury, he breaks out his handgun and he shoots them both, right? There was no premeditation there. Excuse me, there was no planning, but there was definitely malintent, right? Which is why it's second degree murder. It is less serious. It's still pretty serious, but it's less serious than first degree murder because there was no planning. It happened in the heat of rage. It happened in the circumstance. Had there not been the circumstance, it wouldn't have happened. So there's still huge culpability here. You're still going to get many, many decades in prison for this, but it takes capital death, capital execution off the table. because there was no premeditation. And the sentence is likely to be a little bit less stringent because there was no premeditation. I want you to know what felony murder is, and felony murder is the killing of another during the execution of some other felony. So, for example, you didn't intend to go kill somebody that day, but you did intend to break the law. And had you not been breaking the law at that felony capacity, the murder never would have happened, which is why we hold you accountable for felony murder. So, for example, let's say you went to go rob somebody. You absolutely intended on robbing somebody. You went up and, you pulled a gun on them and said, give me your purse. And this person wasn't compliant. They didn't cooperate. They went to smack you and try and grab their purse and get away. And in the commission of them smacking you, you thought they were reaching for your firearm. You pulled your hand back and it caused your finger to pull tension on the trigger. You shoot them and kill them. Well, you never planned to kill that person or murder that person. You just wanted to rob them. The fact of the matter is you did murder them. And if it hadn't been for the commission of that other felony, i.e. the robbery, the death never would have happened. That's an example of felony murder. Manslaughter is the unlawful killing where the degree of culpability is less than that of murder. And there are two categories of manslaughter. There is voluntary manslaughter and there's involuntary manslaughter. Voluntary manslaughter is the intentional infliction of injury that can cause death, and it does. It ends up causing death. So, for example, two people get into a fight in a bar. One person punches the other. That individual falls back. They hit their head on the bar and they die, right? The death occurs as a result of the fight, right? The fight can cause death. It can cause death. Certainly any fight can cause death, right? In this case, the injury that happened as a result of the fight caused death. That's voluntary manslaughter. Involuntary manslaughter is going to be a death that causes negligence. Okay, or excuse me, a death that happened as a result of negligence. So in situations where there's harm and there's danger, but it has been ignored, it hasn't been managed properly, and it results in someone's death, is involuntary manslaughter. So for example, a child whose parents own a handgun, but they did not put the handgun in a safe. They left it on the couch. They left it loaded. They left the safety on. They did not intend to kill that child, but certainly they were wildly negligent, and that negligence resulted in the child picking it up, firing it, hitting themselves and dying. That is involuntary manslaughter, right? Other examples would be like drunk drivers killing a pedestrian crossing the street. They never intended or set out to do that, but it is your actions and your negligent actions that resulted in the death of that individual. So let's talk about risk factors for homicide victimization. So we talked about this before. Let me reiterate that males are most likely to be the victims of homicide. And interestingly enough, they are most likely to be the perpetrator of homicide. Age is a big factor here. People who fall between the ages of 18 and 24 are most likely to be the victims of homicide. As you get older, your risk of victimization of homicide gets smaller and smaller and smaller. Race is another interesting factor of homicide because homicide tends to be intra-racial. That is different than interracial. Intra-racial means the perpetrator and the victim are of the same race. So if it is a white perpetrator, it is going to be a white victim more times than not. If it is an African-American perpetrator, the victim is going to be African-American. Do we see some crossover where it's interracial, which means the perpetrator and the offender have different races? Sure, it happens, but it's minimal. It's minimal. Why? Because homicide's a really personal crime, right? Most of the time people are killing each other or killing somebody because they're angry at you for some reason, which means you have some pre-existing relationship. And largely people are, to some extent, tribal. We stick to our racial groups, right? Which means our conflicts largely are going to happen with the people that we see the most, who are going to, air quotes, look like us, right? They're going to look like my gender, my race, etc., right? So that's an interesting risk factor that is very unique to homicide, that it is intra-racial. We don't see that intra-racial element entering into other types of victimization, whether it's robbery or domestic violence or sexual assault or aggravated assault. We see all sorts of interracial violence in all those other categories, but in homicide, it is intra-racial, which is sort of an interesting fact. Location. We're going to see that people who live or work in urban locations are at far greater risk for homicide than people who live in the suburbs. Again, though, there's an interesting caveat that, okay, this is driven by population density. Okay, driven by population density. So the more people there are in a given area, the more conflicts you're going to have, and ultimately the greater proportion of homicides you're also going to have just because there's more people. Okay. In the vast majority of homicides, the victim and the perpetrator know each other. This is a very personal crime. It is not unheard of for stranger killings to happen where people, the person who gets killed doesn't know the person who's killing them, but it is on the rare side. Right? Most everybody who engages in homicide is at the very least acquainted with their perpetrator and probably knows them far better than an acquaintance. And in fact, the bulk of homicides, by the way, are committed by spouses, family members, right? So you know them very well, unfortunately. The vast majority of homicides are committed with a firearm. Most of those firearms are handguns. Okay. 1/3 of all homicides, law enforcement never figures out why they happened, right? They don't know. We know it happened, but they can never figure out why. That's a big chunk. I mean, you think about that. That's 33% of all homicides. That's thousands and thousands of homicides in a given year that, law enforcement after the fact can't piece together why it happened. They just know it did. Okay. Most homicides occur in private dwellings away from public view, right? This isn't something people do in front of each other because people will call the police, people will try to intervene, people will try to stop the crime from happening. So it's a private crime. Okay. Once again, we're going to see our old friend alcohol kick in here. Alcohol usage and intimate part increases the rate of intimate partner violence. And there is a strong link between intimate partner violence, the use of alcohol, and subsequent homicides of spouses and intimate partners. So there is a huge link there. A large proportion of men who kill their female partners or spouses are under the influence of alcohol at the time of the homicide. There are many different categories of homicide victimization, and I want you to know the definitions for all of them. The first is going to be what we call filicide, and that's going to be the homicide of a child by a parent or a caretaker. It doesn't have to be a parent, right? My go-to example here is Casey Anthony. Yes, I know she was acquitted. I am fully aware of this. But if you examine the forensic evidence, remember that when you are acquitted, it does not mean not guilty. It just means the state couldn't prove your guilt. They didn't have enough evidence to prove your guilt. The forensic evidence is overwhelming that she killed her daughter. It's absolutely overwhelming. This is not uncommon. Okay. And unfortunately, for children under the age of 1, they are one of the highest age groups at risk for homicide because they are so completely vulnerable and dependent on their caretakers. And mothers are the most likely culprits, unfortunately. Okay. So filicide. Filicide is any child, not just children under 1. Infanticide is the killing of children under 1, and they are at the greatest risk. Okay. Children under 1 are at the greatest risk of homicide, and it is most likely to happen at the hands of the mother. Okay. The younger the child, like I said, the greater the risk of homicide victimization. For a lot of very obvious reasons, like I said, they're very vulnerable. They may not quite recognize the risk that they're in and they don't have anybody to tell, or maybe they can't verbalize because they don't understand the risk that they're in. And again, this is a very private crime. It happens behind closed doors. We don't always, teachers, daycare workers, preschool, they don't always know what's going on behind closed doors. But because it is such a common event and because they are so vulnerable and there is such a high risk, in cases of, we call them SUIDI cases, that's capital SUIDI, and it stands for Sudden Unexpected Infant Death Investigation. Any SUIDI case is going to be a child under the age of 1 who dies unexpectedly. An automatic forensic autopsy will be ordered specifically because there is a very, very high probability that child's death was unnatural, that child's death was a homicide. Or at the very, whether it was purposeful or involuntary manslaughter due to neglect, it's very, very likely. So there is always a forensic autopsy that is ordered. Okay, there's also parricide, and that is the murder of one child's parent. It's very, very rare, but when it happens, we hear about it in the media widespread. Okay. The majority of cases that we have seen where parricide has occurred, there is typically a long history of physical abuse, sexual abuse, or both by one or both parents. And in cases where it's by one parent, typically the other parent is also aware of the abuse and does not intervene, does not protect the children. So that is the sort of typical story we hear that happens when a child kills their parents. We can break down parricide into two more specific categories, and the first is going to be patricide, which is the killing of a father, and the other is matricide, which is the killing of the mother. Okay, patricide statistically is far more common than matricide. There's eldercide, which is going to be any murder where the victim is over the age of 65. We have a specific category for this, much like we do infanticide and filicide, because this is a population of people who are vulnerable on the basis of age and physical status, right? Just like babies are not physically strong enough and not cognitively able to take care of themselves or to prevent victimization against them. As we age, we lose muscle mass, we lose agility, speed, strength. We also lose cognitive function. So people who are at the other end of the age spectrum become very vulnerable to being falling victims of homicide. There's also the issue that is, and we're learning more about it. We've known about it for a while, but it's becoming more of a central issue called caretaker fatigue. And that is when adult parents have to take care of their ailing parents. Unlike children, right, with each year, children become a little bit more independent. They become a little bit more self-reliant. The opposite happens with the elderly. With each year, they become a little bit less independent, a little bit less self-reliant, more reliant on the caretakers, which are often their adult children. Adult children are frequently managing careers. They have kids of their own, households of their own, finances of their own, and they have to take care of their ailing parents, their parents' medical bills, their parents' bills overall. And there's a condition that we call caretaker fatigue, that it's just too much for one person. It's overwhelming. The stress is overwhelming. The day-to-day function of managing all of it is overwhelming. And when we see eldercide, we tend to see a presence of caretaker fatigue, that somebody's been juggling all of this for a really long time, their lives, their parents' conditions, and it just burns through them. It just burns through them. And the only way out for these people that they think is, the death of their parents. And so they kill their parents, right? This is a different category from parricide, because this is not on a basis of abuse or neglect. This is on the basis of the only way out for me of this awful reality is to kill my adult parent. We also see eldercide because they have resources, right? And the people who kill them, i.e. their adult children, are going to be the recipients of their money, of their homes, of their items, etc. So there's certainly motivation and there's intention there for people to kill older people. We also see it in nursing care and in nursing homes, where the people who are working there are typically the story behind this is they're just not making very much money, and it is intense work, and it's not always pleasant work, and it's not their parents, so they don't care, right? And we've also seen stories where people come in and say, I was doing them a mercy. They were suffering, so I put them out of their suffering. I have often wondered, over my career and many years of researching all kinds of things, if eldercide is much, much more common than we think it is. I've often wondered if the fact that an old person dies, we don't really question it because they're old. They're on their way to death. It makes sense that they would pass. So I wonder how many elder homicides we have missed because there's no obvious sign of trauma. Or maybe trauma wasn't really investigated because it was just the next expected step of life that of course they're going to pass. So I've often wondered that. We do know that it is an underreported issue, just generally speaking, that we're not totally sure. And that it is more common than we think, but I have I've always wondered, is this way more common than we think? Okay, intimate partner homicide. Intimate partner violence homicide results in a big chunk of homicides. 14% of every homicide that occurs in a given year happens at the hands of intimate partner violence that escalates to the point of a homicide. It is typically a male perpetrator with a female victim. However, intimate partner homicide can happen in any circumstance, and it does. It can be between spouses. It can be between relationships that have partners of the same sex. It can be it's not uncommon for there to be a murder-suicide also in these circumstances where the perpetrator kills their intimate partner and then they kill themselves, right? When that happens, we typically see a firearm involved. The next category is femicide, which is very closely linked to intimate partner homicide, because this is the specific killing of females. The bulk of females who are killed as a result of intimate partner violence. So these two categories are specifically linked. But we do have a separate category of femicide because she is specifically being killed for her role in the relationship as a female. And the final category I want to talk about are honor killings. And honor killings are victims who are typically female. And what we see, this is something that's relatively new to the United States in the past 30 or so years. We didn't see much of this in the prior to 3 decades ago. But what we see is that immigrant populations that come from certain parts of the world that have certain expectations about gender roles immigrate to the United States, where the gender roles between men and women are largely equal in the workplace, economically, behaviorally, and when their female offspring assimilate into Western culture, they are not happy with that behavior, taking on a Western female role, having premarital sex, earning a living, being independent, wearing westernized clothes, and it seemed to bring dishonor to this family based on the culture from which they originally came. And the only way in their culture to re-obtain that honor is to kill that daughter, to kill the person bringing shame on their family. We've seen an uptick in honor killings in the past 3 decades because of changing demographics of immigration. And the honor killings are usually done at the hand of the head of the family, the father of the family, but also are frequently done at the head of the family and his male offspring, so older brothers or younger brothers. Let's talk about homicides that involve multiple victims. So the first is, and people, this is an important area to get straight in terms of verbiage because people tend to use a lot of these as synonyms, which is not correct. Okay, let's start with mass murder. And mass murder is a situation where there are 4 or more individuals killed in one location in one incident. Lots of people will use this term for a lot of other kinds of killings, but that is what it is. It's one incident, more than 4 victims. The Uvalde shootings, the Uvalde elementary school shootings is an example. The individual only went to Uvalde, and he killed, the numbers were well into the double digits of the victims that he killed. Okay. Serial murder, which is one people confuse with mass murder, is something different. It's a series of separate killings. So it is, multiple killings that happen, different incidents, different people, different places, different times. Okay. And this is, this is a huge part of the zeitgeist. It's really central in pop culture for us to have movies and miniseries and documentaries on serial killers like Ted Bundy, like Jeffrey Dahmer, like the BTK killer. America is sort of fascinated by these people. They're very, very rare. Okay, they're very rare. But again, they make huge headlines when there's one that's active who's unidentified. We know when they're active because we tend to see the same patterns in their homicidal tendencies. We see the same signatures, the same behaviors, the same kinds of victims repeated again and again and again. Certainly when we identify them, it becomes a media firestorm. The cases are covered. There's movies, there's books, there's interviews. And I think in part because it's so odd and because it's so rare. Thankfully, it's so rare, right? We don't want people like this running around doing this all the time. But there is a distinction. And sometimes people will say mass murder, but they mean serial killer. They're 2 very different things. There's also spree murder. Spree murder is going to be the killing of at least 2 victims at 2 separate locations, but there's no cooling off period between them. So somebody starts here and they kill at least 2 people here, and they get in the car and they go over to this location and they kill some more people. There's no time in between. It's not separate incidents. It's really one incident with just a little bit of travel in between. And unfortunately, the Sandy Hook murder, the Sandy Hook circumstance is an example of this, where Adam Lanza, the perpetrator, had killed his mother at the first location, got in the car, went to the school where she worked, and subsequently killed, I believe it was 26 children and elementary school teachers. That's an example of a spree murder. One more category of homicide I want you to know about is familicide, and that's when one family member kills multiple family members. Typically when we see this, the age-old story is going to be the father, the husband, is going to kill the wife and he's going to kill the kids. That is the most common manifestation of this category of homicide that we see. Okay. It is usually when it's the father / husband who does this, we usually see a common story that precludes it or that happens beforehand. Usually he lost his job or she's leaving and she's taking the kids. One of those 2. We see that almost in every single case when familicide is perpetrated by the husband and the father. However, we do see other cases as well that come up with some level of, air quotes regularity, because this is thankfully a very rare event. But in the cases that do come up, there is another circumstance we see that is repeated, and that's where one person, and it's typically a child, a young child, a teenage child, or like an early 20-something child, kills the family for financial gain. Okay. Financial gain is the primary motive, but it can also be that, look, they never let me do what I wanted. They were always, keeping me down. They didn't like me. And I knew if I killed my parents and my siblings that I'd have the house and the money would come to me and I could just finally be free of them, go do what I want, be who I want, not be criticized, and I'd have all the money in the world to do it. That's another common story that we see with familicide. Surviving family members of homicides, regardless of what form they take, unfortunately have to endure the stress of death notification. Death notification is where the coroner in your county, the local coroner, is going to show up at your door, usually with law enforcement, one or two members of law enforcement, and they have all been trained in death notifications, how to deliver the news that, I'm sorry to say, your loved one has not only have they passed, not only have they died, but they have died at the hands of violence. They have been killed. Often at that point, very few details can be disclosed because it is an open, active investigation, and law enforcement can't disclose those details, which makes it even harder on the families who are receiving that information, those secondary victims. Of course, they want to know what happened to my child, who did this, why did someone do this, or who did this to my husband? And unfortunately, law enforcement and the coroner have to look at you and say, I'm sorry, we can't disclose that because it's an active, ongoing case, and you're left not just with devastation and heartbreak, but also no real answers about why this happened or who did it, which once again adds to their secondary victimization. It's not only are they secondary victims at the loss of the loved one, but it's another form of trauma that comes as a result of the circumstances and that death notification. People who deliver death notifications will tell you there's a wide array of responses. I mean, most of them obviously are going to be extreme devastation and tears and screaming and crying. But some people lash out, some people get violent. It's a reaction. I will say that the people that do this are very well trained and they are very compassionate. They've done it usually more than once, especially except if it's their first time, obviously, but they tend to do it more than once and they've seen it all, and they know what to expect and they know how to manage people as well as possible, and they tend to do it very well. Surviving family members also have to endure the process of investigation, arrest, and prosecution, which is inevitably stressful. It's painful. It doesn't allow them to begin the healing process of the loss of that loved one. And obviously, all of this tends to occur at the height of grief and the height of bereavement, making that process even more difficult. So we've talked about the surviving family members being secondary victims, but it is those death notifications and surviving that trial process that interferes with their ability to grieve, that is largely contributing to this secondary victimization process.